carrying a silent agreement for so long it feels like reality itself. It's present when an opportunity slips away, and a whisper says, "See, this always happens to you." It's there when a relationship cools and the first thought is, "I must have done something wrong." It's the clenched expectation that life is fundamentally harder on you than it is on everyone else, and that every closed door is a verdict on your worth. But what if that belief isn't a clear-eyed assessment of the facts? What if it's the very lens that's distorting everything you see? Carl Jung mapped the hidden depths of the psyche with a precision that still disorients people a century later. And one of his most unsettling yet liberating insights was this: what shapes a human life is not just the raw material of events, but the unconscious posture through which those events are met. Today we're going to walk straight into that shift. A shift so foundational that by the time you reach the final minute, you may find yourself looking back at the struggles you've resented and realizing that nothing, not a single thing, was ever truly against you in the way you once believed. We'll move through 5 truths that reorganize the psyche from the inside out, and the first one lands like a sudden clean light in a room you've lived in your whole life, but never actually seen. But before we take that first step, I need to place one anchor. This is not about pretending that hardship doesn't exist. It's not about bypassing grief or wearing a forced smile over open wounds. It's about discovering, through raw psychological honesty, that the way you enter a season, a conversation, or a moment of uncertainty changes what that moment can give you. Stay with me, because these 5 truths have a way of peeling back layers you didn't know you were wearing. And underneath them, there's a clarity so sharp it can feel like a second birth. Chapter 1. The mirror you don't know you're holding. Most of us move through the day with a quiet but unshakable conviction that we are seeing the world objectively. We think our reactions to others, to circumstances, to life's twists are simply natural responses to what's out there. But Jung's work reveals a far stranger and more accurate picture. Most of the time, you are not looking at reality. You are looking at the inside of your own mind, projected outward like a film onto a screen you've labeled the real world. Imagine 3 people walking into the same social gathering. The first person scans the room and feels a quiet wave of belonging. They register smiles, open body language, invitation. The second person steps in and immediately senses hidden judgment. There's certain people are noticing their outfit, their hesitations, their lack of status. The third person feels invisible, convinced that no one here would care what they have to say. The room is identical. The faces are identical. The only variable is the internal atmosphere each person carried through the door. That atmosphere is built from years of personal history, unprocessed wounds, deep beliefs about the self that were formed before you ever had the language to question them, unnamed fears that orbit the psyche like silent moons. I once stumbled into a vivid demonstration of this law in the most ordinary setting. Some years ago, I ran into an old colleague I'll call David. Our last interaction had been tense, a disagreement over a project that left me convinced he had marked me as incompetent. I'd replayed that conversation hundreds of times, adding details each replay, until the memory had calcified into a solid, painful truth. David doesn't respect me. So when I saw him across a coffee shop, my stomach tightened. My breathing became shallow. I prepared a polite but frosty smile, expecting the same from him. But David looked up, hesitated, and then said with a sincerity that fully disarmed me, "I've been hoping I'd run into you. I never properly thanked you for pushing back on that project. You were right, and I was too stubborn to admit it back then." In that instant, a decade of inner narrative collapsed. The tension had never come from David. It was a story I'd carried alone, a loop of projection that painted his face with my own unfinished business, and then called him the source. Jung named this phenomenon projection, and he considered it one of the most pervasive and unrecognized forces in human life. When an emotion, a fear, or a belief exists in the unconscious, unseen, unexamined, the psyche cannot hold it as inner content. It must externalize it. And so we see in others, in situations, in the very structure of life, what is actually lurking in the basement of our own awareness. The irritation you feel towards someone's arrogance? Often it's a shadowy reflection of an assertive part of yourself that was shamed into hiding long ago. The deep discomfort you feel around someone who seems emotionally needy? That may mirror a part of you that craves care, but was taught to view that need as pathetic. How many of the conflicts in your life would dissolve overnight if you could truly see that the battle was never really with the other person, but with a mirror you didn't know you were holding? Think of the mind as a deep, still lake. When the lake is stirred, churned by old sediment, unprocessed memories, inherited beliefs, silent fears, the reflections it casts onto the world are broken and distorted. You look at life and see chaos, hostility, threat. But when awareness begins to let that sediment settle, through honest self-observation, through gently noticing, I'm reacting strongly here. What is this really about? The water clears. The outer scene remains physically the same, yet what you perceive transforms. You start seeing people more accurately, interpreting circumstances with less catastrophic color, noticing paths that were always there but previously filtered out. Jung did not believe the inner world was a private, trivial theater. He believed it was the very organ of perception itself. Change the inner state, and the outer world, though materially unchanged, shifts in felt quality, and in the range of possibilities you can now detect. This is why the journey of understanding life must always, without exception, start with the quieter, braver work of understanding yourself. Your strongest reactions, your automatic judgments, the places where you feel most armored and defensive, these are not proof of what is wrong out there. They are signposts pointing with startling accuracy to the unfinished business inside you. Most people exhaust their energy trying to rearrange the furniture of the outer world. They switch jobs, cities, relationships, convinced the problem will be solved by a new external arrangement. But until the inner lens is cleaned, they carry the same patterns into every new scene, and they keep meeting the same faces in different bodies. Jung's invitation is utterly counterintuitive to the modern doer. Look inward first. When you comprehend your own depths, without flinching, the world outside stops appearing as a persecutor and starts revealing the hidden support woven even into difficulty. And as that shift takes root, you realize something remarkable. Many of the things that once triggered you, that once hurt you, were only mirrors reflecting the parts of yourself you hadn't yet learned to hold with compassion. Chapter 2. The language the unconscious actually speaks. Once a person begins to sense that the outer world mirrors the inner, a deeper layer of psychology quickly reveals itself. Beneath the conscious mind, the voice that narrates your day and makes plans, exists a silent, immensely powerful intelligence, the unconscious. And this part of you does not respond to beautiful affirmations. It does not argue with your logic. It does not file your good intentions in a to-do list. It watches what you do, and it remembers. Jung once wrote a sentence so brutally simple, it can feel like a physical repositioning of the spine. You are what you do, not what you say you'll do. That line dismantles a comforting but dangerous illusion. Many of us believe we are the sum of our intentions. We believe that because we genuinely want to change, some deep part of us has already changed. But the unconscious doesn't store intentions. It stores repeated evidence. If you tell yourself every morning that you're becoming confident, yet every day you avoid eye contact, swallow your opinions, and shrink from visibility, the deepest part of your mind learns the same old lesson. I am someone who hides. Why does this happen with such stubborn consistency? Because the unconscious processes lived experience, not language. Each repeated action is like a groove worn into a neural forest path. Walk the same trail of avoidance 100 times, and it becomes the automatic route. Even when you consciously decide to take a different turn, the moment uncertainty spikes, your mind guides you back to the familiar path, because that path, however painful, is encoded as safe, or at least survivable. Imagine the unconscious as a vast, untouched meadow, and each action you take as a footstep pressing down the grass. A single step leaves almost no visible mark. But after hundreds of mornings where you choose to avoid the hard conversation, a visible trail carves itself. After hundreds of afternoons where you reach for distraction instead of facing the blank page, another trail. Eventually, these trails become so well worn that the mind defaults to them before you even realize a choice is being made. That is how identity forms, not from grand declarations, but from thousands of small, consistent proofs. I recall a message from a man who had spent decades believing he wasn't creative. He worked in a technical field, followed a rigid routine, and had completely accepted the story, "I'm just not the imaginative type. It's not in my wiring." One winter, almost as an experiment with no expectation, he started waking 20 minutes earlier to sketch. Anything. A lamp, his hand, a coffee cup. The first few weeks were painful. His hand felt clumsy. His inner critic was merciless. And the only thing he felt was discomfort. But he persisted, not because he believed he was unlocking a hidden talent, but because he was curious what would happen if he sent a different signal into the silent layers of his mind. Months passed. Something quiet shifted. He noticed he was bringing a different energy to team meetings, more exploratory, less rigid. He started posing questions instead of only logging answers. The identity "I am not creative" hadn't been disproved by a sudden epiphany. It had been undermined by a mountain of small evidence to the contrary, stacked one sketch at a time. His unconscious rewrote the story simply because the actions on the ground told a new one. This is why real, durable transformation rarely begins with a thunderous decision. It begins with a small, concrete deviation from the normal script. A person accustomed to withdrawing tries showing up a little more openly. Just one genuine sentence in a meeting. A chronic procrastinator does the avoided task for 5 minutes. The act itself feels tiny, but the signal it fires into the deeper psyche is tectonic. What makes this process even more fascinating is that the emotions people typically believe must come before action. Feelings of confidence, clarity, readiness, very frequently appear after the action has been taken, not before. When you wait until you feel unafraid, you may wait a lifetime. But when you take a trembling step, the psyche registers evidence. I am the kind of person who moves despite fear. Repeat that step, and the internal map redraws itself. The emotion of confidence, which you thought was a prerequisite, arrives as a result. So I want to pause and ask you directly, is there a gap between the identity you announce to yourself and the identity your daily actions are quietly proving? And what is the smallest possible action you could take tomorrow, so small it feels almost trivial, that would start to plant a different piece of evidence in the meadow of your unconscious? Because the unconscious is always listening, not to your words, but to your footsteps. And when those footsteps begin to trace a new trail, the story you live from, the deepest, most shaping story, begins to change from the ground up. Chapter 3. The archetype that's been waiting for your move. Once new actions are repeated long enough, something deeper than habit begins to stir. Jung observed that the human psyche contains universal, primordial patterns he called archetypes. Innate blueprints of experience that surface in every culture, every epoch, every great story ever told. And one of the most critical for a life of substance is the archetype of the hero. Not the hero of myth with a gleaming sword and public victory, but a psychological potential lying dormant in you. The capacity to rise, to face what most frightens you, and to gradually, imperfectly, become who you are genuinely meant to be. A woman once shared a story that has stayed with me for years. On paper, her life was stable, a responsible job, a decent network, no outward catastrophe. But inside she felt hollow, like an actor who had memorized someone else's lines and wore someone else's costume. Every evening she'd come home and feel a low current of dread she couldn't name. The years felt as if they were evaporating, while her true self remained buried in a back room of her awareness, waiting. One night she encountered Jung's idea that the most important journey of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. Not achieving a perfect ideal, not satisfying some external blueprint, but slowly, painstakingly, carving a path back to the authentic self that got covered over by years of adaptation. That thought lodged in her like a splinter of light, irritating but illuminating. She began with a single alteration. Once a week, she set aside 2 hours to revisit something she had loved as a teenager before the world told her to be practical, creative writing. She didn't quit her job. She didn't announce a new identity to her friends. She simply started placing a small, deliberate action in the direction of the person she used to feel herself to be. Months passed. Nothing dramatic happened outwardly. But she said she began to feel more solid, as if some inner tectonic plate had shifted back into alignment. The image she held of herself slowly morphed from woman trapped in a role to woman quietly building a bridge to a truer life. That shift, that moment of daring to move toward the call even without a clear destination, is precisely when the hero archetype begins to activate in a human psyche. Not when the ending is certain, but when a person steps forward into the unfamiliar, because something inside refuses to stay small. Jung taught that every one of us wears a social mask he called the persona. It's necessary. It helps us navigate jobs, social norms, collective expectations. But if we live entirely inside the persona, we become hollow. We lose contact with the deeper self that contains our genuine vitality, creativity, and sense of meaning. The hero's journey in Jungian psychology is the long, unglamorous process of peeling away the layers of adaptive pretense to recover that core. It's not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming yourself, fully, which is often far scarier than achieving a standard goal. Think of a seed buried in dark soil. From the surface, nothing appears to happen for a long stretch. But beneath the earth, the seed is splitting open, sending out roots, preparing to break through toward light. The hero within you works the same way. The world may not applaud the early movements. There may be no visible results for a season. But each time you honor your inner direction in a tangible way, even microscopically, you feed that underground growth. The obstacle is that the hero's call often arrives wrapped in discomfort. It asks you to express a truth you've swallowed for years, to risk criticism, to say, "This is who I am," even if it's not who you wanted me to be. That feels genuinely dangerous, because the old persona was designed to protect you from rejection and exile. But Jung insisted that individuation, the process of becoming a psychologically whole human being, requires walking directly toward that fear, not extinguishing it, but moving while it's still active. The hero is not the one who feels no fear. The hero is the part of you that keeps walking while the fear is still speaking. And here is the hidden gift that reveals itself only in motion. When you take even a small step in the direction of your deeper truth, the psyche registers that act of courage. It begins to reorient your energy. What once seemed impossible starts to feel, not easy, but imaginable, reachable. You discover that the power you've been searching for in motivational content and external tools has been dormant inside you all along, waiting for one honest signal that says, "I'm ready to live from the center, not from the mask." Chapter 4. The trust that makes a path visible. At this stage, a new and unsettling tension emerges. Once you start sensing the inner call, you also realize that the road ahead does not present itself with perfect clarity. You know you can't retreat to the old way without betraying something essential. But the new way is hazy, unmarked, and filled with questions. This is the territory where trust, what Jung might call a mature, psychologically honest faith, becomes not a luxury, but a survival faculty. Jung wrote, "Faith, hope, love, and insight are the highest achievements of human effort." He wasn't describing a naive, childish optimism that ignores difficulty. He was pointing to an active psychological capacity that enables a person to move through the long, dim stretches of life, where the rational mind cannot yet compute the whole outcome. Life rarely offers a full, illuminated map. The most pivotal choices in a human life, leaving a career that feels dead, starting a creative pursuit with no guarantee, speaking a truth that could fracture a close relationship, are almost always made in fog. There's a fascinating piece of neuroscience that illuminates this. The brain contains a cluster of neurons called the reticular activating system, a filter that scans the immense flood of sensory data and decides what's relevant to your conscious awareness. It's the reason you suddenly notice a particular car model everywhere after you've been considering buying it. The cars were always there. Your filter simply deprioritized them before. When a person commits to a direction, not waiting for all the answers, but taking a concrete step, this system begins to recalibrate. It starts to spotlight opportunities, resources, and people that align with that direction. Material that was always present in the environment but previously screened out as meaningless noise. This is not mystical law of attraction. It's the biology of focused intention, interacting with a brain that's desperate to be efficient. But here is the crucial catch. The reticular activating system doesn't fully activate while you're sitting in hesitation. It activates in motion. You must step into the uncertainty before the relevant signals begin to clarify. Imagine holding a small lantern while walking through a dense forest at night. The light reaches maybe 3 meters ahead. If you demand to see the entire trail before you move, you will stand still forever. But if you take one step into the dimness, the lantern reveals the next 3 meters, and then the next. The path doesn't reveal itself all at once. It reveals itself one courageous, imperfect step at a time. I've seen this pattern repeat across countless life stories. A graduate terrified to leave her small town accepted a modest internship in a city she barely knew, with no promise of a future. Within 2 years, the connections she made in that unglamorous role opened a door to work she never could have planned from the safety of her childhood bedroom. A man in his 50s, convinced he had nothing to offer outside his corporate identity, started volunteering at a community workshop on a whim. That small act led to a second career that finally felt aligned with his values, a path he couldn't see when he was sitting at home trying to think his way into clarity. None of them had guarantees. All of them moved first, and the path appeared second. Jung would say that many people remain stranded in life not because they lack ability, but because they demand emotional certainty before they'll risk a move. They want the anxious voice inside to quiet itself first. But the psyche matures precisely at the edge between the familiar and the unknown. At that edge, you face a decision that defines futures: retreat into the zone of known discomfort, or keep walking with only a dim but persistent sense of rightness. What's remarkable is that when people cross that threshold, they frequently discover they are substantially stronger than they believed. New capabilities rise to the surface. Unexpected resilience unfolds, not because the outer circumstances instantly become easy, but because they've begun stepping into a different version of themselves. One built not on guarantees, but on participation in discovery. So I'll ask you to pause here, genuinely. Is there a step you've been postponing because you can't yet see the full staircase? A conversation you've been avoiding? A skill you want to begin? A change that feels terrifying, but also, if you're quiet enough, true? What if the only missing element isn't a guarantee, but a single step taken in trust? Because the pattern repeats across human experience like a signature, the path doesn't appear first. The path appears as you walk. And walking while the future is still unformed, while the inner critic is still loud, is precisely what builds a life of substance. Chapter 5. You are not the author alone, but a co-creator. When a person begins to walk with that flavor of trust, they eventually arrive at a recognition so profound it reshapes their entire relationship with reality. For years, perhaps decades, they had been trying to control everything: outcomes, other people's perceptions, the precise sequence of events. And the effort left them exhausted, anxious, and subtly bitter. But now a different understanding starts to dawn. Life is not a machine whose every gear can be micromanaged by human will. And it is also not a random, meaningless chaos. It's a living, responsive interaction. Jung crystallized this with a statement that, when truly absorbed, restructures the psyche's relationship to its own story. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. What most people label as fate, the repeated patterns, the recurring disappointments, the sense of being cursed or stuck, Jung argued is often nothing more than unconscious patterns running their course, untouched by awareness. They choose your partners, your career moves, your reactions to stress, all while you believe you're making free, rational decisions. You are not a puppet dangled by destiny, and you are also not an all-powerful author who writes the whole narrative alone. You are a co-creator. Think of life as a vast musical composition being performed by an orchestra. You are not the composer who dictates every note of every instrument, but you are a musician with your own part to play. You can't decide what the cellos will do. You don't get to script the percussion. But you can decide how you play your instrument, the tone of your response, the quality of your presence, the notes you choose to bring into the collective sound. And when you alter your playing, when you shift from a posture of defensive reaction to one of intentional expression, the entire composition shifts in response. The music feels different, not because the other instruments magically changed their parts, but because the interplay has been fundamentally altered. This is why two people can endure strikingly similar setbacks and yet emerge with completely divergent inner worlds. One interprets hardship as a senseless assault and becomes brittle, armored, resentful. The other, without denying the pain, asks, "What is this experience carving out of me? What strength, what depth, what compassion is being forged in this fire?" and begins to move forward shaped by that question. The external facts may be comparable, but the way each person participates in those facts generates two entirely different realities. Consider the story of an entrepreneur named Sarah Blakely, who grew up with a father who would ask his children each evening, "What did you fail at today?" If they hadn't failed, he worried they hadn't stretched themselves enough. That single reframe, failure as evidence of experimentation rather than a verdict on worth, completely rewired her psychological architecture. When she later faced repeated rejections while trying to launch her business, her internal operating system didn't interpret those rejections as cosmic signals to stop. It read them as data points on a creative journey, as necessary friction. She didn't control the rejections. She profoundly influenced how she metabolized them. And that shift allowed her to persist until the environment began to cooperate. In Jungian terms, this is what happens when you drag unconscious patterns into awareness. You stop being run by old automatic scripts that said failure means I'm defective, rejection means I'm unlovable, closed doors mean the universe is hostile. You begin choosing your response with conscious presence. And every conscious choice is a stitch in the fabric of a different life. Imagine a potter working with clay. The clay has its own nature, its density, its moisture, its tendency to collapse if pushed too aggressively. The potter cannot simply impose any shape, but through sensitive, responsive, hands-on dialogue, the potter and the clay create something together that neither could produce alone. Life operates on a similar principle. When you try to force it into a rigid, pre-imagined shape, the material of reality resists and eventually breaks. But when you learn to listen, to feel the grain of your circumstances, to sense what's being asked of you. And when you apply your intention with patient responsiveness, a new form emerges. A form you couldn't have designed in advance, but one that unmistakably carries your signature. The practical shift is surprisingly simple to describe and a lifetime to master. Instead of asking obsessively, how can I control this situation so it obeys my will? You learn to ask a different, quieter question. What is this situation asking of me? And what can I bring to it from my deepest, most honest self? You stop exhausting yourself in a war against life. You enter a dialogue. And when that shift happens, a curious sense of lightness often appears, even when the external weight remains heavy. Because you're no longer trying to grip the steering wheel of a universe that was never designed to be steered by your anxiety. You've begun, perhaps for the first time, to co-create with the stream of life rather than battle it. That is the deepest meaning beneath this fifth truth. You do not need to be an all-powerful controller to live a meaningful, directed, impactful life. You only need to step into each day with awareness, with a trust that has learned to move alongside uncertainty, and with a quiet willingness to bring your authentic note into the living symphony. A brief interlude. The alchemy of small, conscious shifts. Before we gather these threads into a closing that you'll carry with you, let me speak directly to the part of you that wonders. This all sounds profound, but where does it actually touch Monday morning? Jung was not a detached theoretician. He was a physician of the soul, and his framework points to daily, quiet practices that accumulate into a transformed life. There are 3 micro-practices, so simple they almost seem too small to matter, that compress everything we've explored into lived behavior. First, the pause before reaction. When you feel a strong automatic reaction, irritation, defensiveness, a wave of hurt, train yourself to pause for 3 seconds. In that tiny gap, silently ask, what part of me is this stirring? What old story just woke up? This pause is the doorway between unconscious reaction and conscious response. Over time, it reshapes the neural architecture of your relationships. Second, the daily evidence note. Each evening, write 1 sentence describing a moment where your action aligned with the person you want to become, no matter how small. Today I spoke my opinion in the meeting instead of staying silent. Today I chose 5 minutes of the hard task instead of infinite scrolling. This practice feeds the unconscious new data, slowly rewriting the core narrative. Third, the co-creator inquiry. When facing a dilemma, replace the question, how can I control this? With what is one thing I can genuinely bring to this situation from my best self, while also accepting what I cannot decide? This shifts you from demanding dominance to participating with wisdom. These are not grand gestures. They're seeds. But seeds, when consistently planted, crack concrete. Conclusion, the posture that changes everything. As our exploration settles into stillness, let me say clearly what I believe Jung's legacy offers in times like ours. It's not a technique for manipulating outcomes. It's not a life hack. It's a radical reorientation of how you meet your own existence. When a person begins to live from the assumption that even the difficult, confusing, seemingly unjust chapters are building something essential in them, shaping depth, discernment, or a compassion they couldn't access otherwise, they stop feeling like they're perpetually in a fight against life. They start walking with quiet awareness, seeing the mirrors they once mistook for enemies, honoring the subtle language of action over empty intention, allowing the inner hero to stir through small, courageous gestures, trusting enough to move while the path is still dim, and easing into the creative dialogue with a reality that is, at its core, more responsive than they ever imagined. Acting as if everything is ultimately unfolding for your benefit is not a naive denial of suffering. It is a psychological posture, a deliberate, chosen frame that keeps you steady when everything in your conditioning screams that you should collapse into victimhood or despair. It is the daily decision to meet life not as a punishment trying to break you, but as a process trying to grow you into a more whole, more honest version of yourself. And here is what I want you to take into the quiet hours after this video ends. When you shift that posture, something shifts in how the world meets you, not because reality magically rearranged its fundamental particles, but because you are finally seeing it with eyes that can perceive the support woven inside the struggle, the door hidden in the wall you'd been pushing against. If these reflections stirred something inside you, a recognition, a discomfort, a new curiosity, acknowledge that movement by pressing like and subscribing to this channel. Because sometimes, the thing waiting ahead is not just an answer, not just a solution to a problem, but a version of you that has been waiting for your conscious permission to finally begin living.